The torment of the people of Gaza continues unabated. More than 41,000 Palestinians have been killed. Homes, hospitals, churches, mosques, and schools lie destroyed. Famine and disease stalk the streets of Gaza. This cannot but shock our collective humanity. The violence the Palestinian people are being subjected to is a grim continuation of more than half a century of apartheid. Through the United Nations and the instruments it wields, we must end the suffering that Palestinians are being subjected to. We are called upon to uphold the principles of the UN Charter and to uphold consistently and in their entirety the fundamental tenets of international law. International law cannot be applied selectively. No one state is more equal than any other. We reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire and for the release of all hostages. The only lasting solution is the establishment of a Palestinian state, a state that will exist side by side with Israel. 78 years since its formation, the structure of the United Nations Security Council remains largely unchanged. Africa and its 1.4 billion people remain excluded from its key decision-making structures. This cannot continue. The Security Council has not fulfilled its mandate to maintain international peace and security. The UN Security Council must be reformed as a matter of agency.
Africa's geopolitical posture has entered a volatile new phase, marked by rising tensions between African leaders, Western governments, and international institutions. At the center of this moment stands South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, whose recent statements and diplomatic actions have ignited controversy across global capitals. His comments regarding Burkina Faso's leader Ibrahim Traoré, combined with sharp criticism of U.S. tariff threats and perceived pressure from multilateral bodies, have reshaped Africa's engagement with the United Nations and the West. For years, African leaders have expressed frustration over how international institutions respond to political change on the continent. Sanctions, aid suspensions, travel restrictions, and diplomatic isolation have often followed military takeovers or non-West aligned policy shifts. While these measures are officially framed as tools to protect democracy and human rights, critics argue they are applied selectively and disproportionately to African states. Ramaphosa's intervention has brought this debate into the open. Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré has emerged as a symbol of this tension. Since assuming power, Traoré has repositioned Burkina Faso away from traditional Western military partnerships and toward a model emphasizing sovereignty, resource control, and regional security cooperation. His government has reduced reliance on Western forces, restructured mining agreements, and promoted domestic production in agriculture and industry. These moves have drawn strong reactions from Western governments and international organizations concerned about governance, security, and regional stability. Ramaphosa's remarks did not claim the existence of a single written UN plan, but rather pointed to what he described as coordinated international pressure involving diplomatic isolation, narrative framing, and economic leverage aimed at delegitimizing certain African governments. His position reflects a broader concern among African leaders that multilateral institutions increasingly mirror the geopolitical interests of powerful states rather than operating as neutral arbiters. South Africa's stance is significant because of its unique position. As Africa's most industrialized economy and a long-standing participant in global governance structures, South Africa occupies a bridge between the global South and Western institutions. Ramaphosa's decision to speak openly signals growing impatience with what many African governments perceive as unequal treatment. At the same time, U.S. tariff threats have intensified these tensions. Washington has increasingly used trade measures as leverage in geopolitical disputes, targeting countries that pursue policies deemed unfavorable to U.S. interests. African exporters, particularly in minerals, agriculture, and manufactured goods, have expressed concern that such tariffs undermine development and punish countries seeking economic independence. Ramaphosa's criticism of these tariff threats reflects South Africa's broader trade anxiety. The country relies heavily on access to global markets for minerals, vehicles, and manufactured goods. Tariff escalation threatens jobs, currency stability, and long-term investment. By linking U.S. trade pressure with international political narratives around leaders like Traore, Ramaphosa framed the issue as part of a larger pattern of coercion rather than isolated policy disputes. The reaction from Washington was measured but firm. U.S. officials reiterated commitments to democratic governance and rules-based trade, denying any coordinated effort to undermine specific African leaders. However, the timing of diplomatic warnings, aid reviews, and trade discussions has fueled skepticism across Africa. Within the United Nations, the situation is equally complex. The UN operates through member states, and its actions often reflect the balance of power within its councils and agencies. African diplomats have long argued that Africa's interests are underrepresented despite the continent's large membership. Ramaphosa's comments tapped into long-standing calls for UN reform, including expanded African representation on the Security Council. Burkina Faso's supporters argued that Traore's policies address real grievances left unresolved by decades of external intervention. Persistent insecurity, economic stagnation, and resource exploitation created conditions that fueled instability. By prioritizing domestic control and regional alliances, Traore's government claims to be addressing root causes rather than symptoms. Critics counter that military-led governments risk entrenching authoritarianism and limiting civic freedoms. They argue that international pressure is necessary to encourage democratic transitions. Ramaphosa's position does not deny these concerns but challenges the methods used to address them, particularly when they involve economic punishment or diplomatic isolation. Across Africa, public opinion is increasingly skeptical of Western intentions. Social media, alternative news platforms, and grassroots movements amplify narratives of resistance and sovereignty. Leaders like Traore resonate with younger populations frustrated by unemployment, insecurity, and perceived neo-colonial dynamics. Ramaphosa's statements align South Africa with this shifting public mood, even as he maintains diplomatic caution. The BRICS bloc adds another layer to the story. South Africa's participation in BRICS provides alternatives to Western-dominated financial and political systems. As BRICS expands its influence, African leaders see opportunities to diversify partnerships and reduce vulnerability to unilateral pressure. Ramaphosa's criticism of tariffs and institutional bias reflects this multipolar strategy. Economic implications are far-reaching. If African countries increasingly resist Western pressure, global supply chains could be reshaped. Minerals critical to energy transitions, such as lithium, cobalt, and manganese, are concentrated in Africa. Trade disputes and political tensions could disrupt access, driving up costs and accelerating competition among global powers. The situation also tests Africa's internal unity. While some governments quietly support Ramaphosa's stance, others remain cautious, balancing sovereignty with access to aid and investment. The African Union faces pressure to articulate a common position on external intervention, sanctions, and trade coercion. Ramaphosa's intervention does not mark a break with the West, but it does signal recalibration. South Africa continues to engage with the United States, Europe, and the UN, but with a firmer insistence on respect and dialogue. The message is that Africa's leaders expect partnership, not prescription. International reactions continue to unfold. Analysts debate whether Ramaphosa's statements represent a turning point or a rhetorical flourish. What is clear is that the conversation has shifted. African leaders are increasingly willing to question global power structures publicly, rather than confining dissent to closed diplomatic channels. For Ibrahim Traoré, the spotlight brings both opportunity and risk. International scrutiny intensifies expectations at home and abroad. Success in improving security and economic conditions could strengthen his position. Failure could reinforce critics' arguments. Ramaphosa's defense, implicit or explicit, elevates Traore's status within continental politics. The United Nations now faces renewed scrutiny over its role in African affairs. Calls for reform, fairness, and genuine partnership grow louder. Whether these calls translate into institutional change remains uncertain. The United States, meanwhile, must decide how to respond to a more assertive Africa. Continued reliance on tariffs and pressure could accelerate the very realignment Washington seeks to prevent. Engagement based on mutual benefit may prove more effective, but requires political will. Africa's geopolitical awakening is not uniform, but it is unmistakable. Ramaphosa's statements crystallize a moment of transition, where silence gives way to challenge and accommodation gives way to negotiation. The implications will shape Africa's global position for years to come. This episode underscores a central reality. Africa is no longer content to be a passive arena for global competition. Its leaders are asserting agency, questioning narratives, and demanding a seat at the table. The responses from the UN, the United States, and other global actors will determine whether this moment leads to cooperation or confrontation.
You've been watching Echoes of Africa, where every story carries the sound of tomorrow. If this moved you, subscribe now, like, and share so Africa's voice never fades into silence.